In a chamber meant for dignity, one insult would ignite a firestorm. The marble walls of the Senate hearing room seemed to hold their breath as Tim Scott leaned forward, his voice sharpened into a blade. He thought he was striking a blow that would humiliate, a line that would define the exchange in his favor. His words were not just pointed, they were dripping with the kind of arrogance that assumes the other side will simply bow, that the room will laugh along, that silence will follow. But silence did not follow. The insult echoed across the chamber, bouncing between cameras and notepads, waiting for its victim to crumble. And yet, across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. Her eyes, steady and unshaken, told a different story. In that instant, before her lips even parted, there was a sense that the balance of power had shifted. Viewers at home might not have known her every word yet, but they felt the electricity, the tension in the pause. Tim Scott's smirk, his calculated confidence, hung heavy in the air. He expected a stumble. He expected retreat. What he didn't expect was what came next, a response as precise as it was devastating. Jasmine Crockett inhaled, slowly, the kind of breath taken by someone who has lived a lifetime of dismissals and yet refuses to be defined by them. Her clapback wasn't rage, it wasn't chaos. It was measured, surgical, carrying the weight of every woman, every immigrant child, every silenced voice who had ever been told to sit down. The room seemed to lean toward her, waiting. Staffers paused their notes, journalists raised their pens higher, the hum of chatter died away. Every second before her words landed was its own kind of defiance, a living refusal to be intimidated. And then, the moment came. Words that sliced through arrogance with the elegance of truth. A counterstrike not delivered in anger, but in clarity so piercing that even those rooting against her had to acknowledge its force. Cameras zoomed. Phones began to buzz. Something seismic had shifted. Because what happened next would silence even the loudest voices. The chamber was not merely a room of polished wood and cameras, it was a battlefield where two visions of America collided. The moment Tim Scott hurled his attack and Jasmine Crockett steadied herself to respond, the political climate outside those walls came roaring in. This wasn't just a sparring match between two elected officials, it was a mirror reflecting the deeper tensions simmering across the nation. For years, America had been trapped in a tug-of-war over identity, who belongs, who has the right to speak, and whose voices are dismissed as too loud, too angry, too inconvenient. In that tense room, Scott carried himself as though his words were the final judgment, echoing a familiar arrogance that history has repeated again and again. Yet Crockett's presence itself was a rebuke to that narrative, a living reminder that America's story has never belonged to just one face or one voice. The racial undertones were impossible to ignore. Here was a black man, Tim Scott, wielding rhetoric that echoed the establishment's playbook, attacking a black woman who stood for defiance, representation, and unshakable pride. To some, his barbs were political strategy, to others, they were betrayal, a performance of power at the expense of dignity. And to the millions watching, it wasn't just about Scott and Crockett. It was about whether the same tired strategies of belittlement and dismissal would still work in an era where social media could amplify a single clapback into a cultural moment. The public expectations weighed heavy. Progressives expected Crockett to rise above, to transform his insult into a rallying cry. Conservatives expected Scott to dominate, to prove his stature by silencing opposition. The stage was loaded with symbolism. Every pause, every raised eyebrow, every carefully chosen word would be dissected across headlines, timelines, and living room conversations. And this mattered, because at stake wasn't just political theater. It was identity. It was the idea that dignity doesn't have to bow to arrogance. It was the truth that America's progress has always come from those who refused to stay silent when silence was demanded of them. Crockett's poised silence in those first moments wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was the calm before the storm that so many had been waiting to witness. Justice hung in the balance, not in the legal sense, but in the emotional truth of fairness, respect, and humanity. Millions of viewers wanted validation. They wanted proof that arrogance doesn't always win, that someone could stand in the fire and emerge unburned, stronger, sharper, and louder. In Crockett, they saw the possibility of that proof. The chamber was thick with anticipation. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, knowing this was no ordinary exchange. The clash symbolized two Americas, one clinging to old hierarchies of power, the other daring to demand recognition, equality, and voice. It wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning. And as the insult settled and Crockett prepared to answer, no one in that room fully grasped what was about to unfold. Little did they know, the audience, and history, were about to pick a side. Tim Scott had built his career on an image, polished, disciplined, carefully aligned with the corridors of power. He was, on the surface, the exception, proof that someone could climb the Republican ranks while breaking the mold of expectation. But beneath the crafted smile and measured tones lay contradictions that became impossible to ignore the longer he stayed in the spotlight. On one hand, Scott often spoke of unity, of being a bridge builder in a divided America. He liked to present himself as someone who had risen above partisanship, a symbol of perseverance. Yet when the cameras rolled, his language sharpened. His dismissive style wasn't just a tactic, it was a habit. He leaned into rhetoric that minimized his opponents, brushing them aside with an air of superiority, as if their arguments didn't deserve to stand in the same room. That pattern carried a cost. His speeches were filled with polished sound bites but rarely with the vulnerability that stirs genuine connection. He could talk at length about opportunity but would reduce real pain into talking points. He could call for civility while sneering at those who challenged him. This duality was his contradiction, a man who branded himself as dignified but thrived on belittlement. The record speaks loudly. He had dismissed critics as overreacting. He had leaned on humor to undermine legitimate grievances. He had reduced sharp policy critiques into caricatures, mocking opponents rather than engaging them. For his allies, this made him effective, a fighter who knew how to win a headline. For his detractors, it made him hollow, a man more invested in looking strong than in listening deeply. In debate after debate, this style carried him forward. Arrogance, after all, can look like confidence on television. He could smirk and pivot, charm and condescend in the same breath. He had learned that belittling opponents not only rattled them but entertained the very audiences he wanted to keep. And so, arrogance became his default stance, a weapon polished over years, a shield against vulnerability, a mask of invincibility. But arrogance is a fragile thing. It demands constant victory, constant validation. It thrives only when others flinch, stumble, or yield. And in that Senate chamber, Tim Scott believed he was about to score another easy win. His jab at Jasmine Crockett was part of the script he had written for himself countless times before: diminish the opponent, maintain control, walk away unscathed. Yet arrogance, when unchecked, becomes a tragic flaw. The more he leaned on dismissal, the more he failed to recognize when the ground beneath him was shifting. The nation had grown tired of smug superiority. Audiences craved authenticity, not arrogance dressed as composure. And across from him sat a woman who embodied precisely what his style could not crush: calm resilience sharpened by experience, wit honed by survival. For years, Tim Scott's approach had worked. His barbs had landed. His smiles had disarmed. His opponents had stumbled under the weight of his dismissal. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was not facing a politician who would shrink or a voice that could be silenced. Tonight, he was facing someone who knew exactly how to turn his weapon back on him. And as his words echoed, arrogance carrying them like a banner, the seeds of his downfall were being planted. What he believed would be a triumph was about to unravel before millions of eyes. His tragic flaw was about to meet its reckoning. For years, this approach had worked, until tonight. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in the halls of Congress, she knew what it meant to be underestimated. She grew up in a world where nothing was guaranteed, where every achievement had to be clawed for, earned twice over, and defended at every turn. Her origins were not scripted in privilege or padded by connections. They were rooted in struggle, the kind that forges resilience not as a choice, but as a necessity. As a young woman, Crockett saw firsthand how the deck was stacked against communities like hers. She watched neighbors work hard and still be left behind. She saw schools starved of resources, families silenced by systems designed to keep them quiet, dreams deferred not because of lack of ambition but because opportunity had been locked behind invisible gates. These were not statistics to her, they were her daily reality. It was in this world that Crockett discovered the sharpness of her wit and the fire of her voice. If she wanted to be heard, she had to speak louder, clearer, and with more precision than anyone else in the room. If she wanted to be respected, she couldn't wait for it to be handed to her, she had to claim it, again and again. And so she did. She studied harder. She fought longer. She learned to turn every dismissal into fuel, every insult into ammunition, every underestimation into a platform. Her journey through law was not a polished, preordained path. It was a battle. As a public defender, she stood for those who had no defenders, facing down systems that treated human beings as disposable. She didn't just learn the law, she learned how to wield it as a weapon for justice, how to bend the sterile language of statutes into a shield for the powerless. Every case hardened her resolve, sharpening her ability to remain composed while chaos swirled around her. By the time she entered politics, Crockett carried more than credentials. She carried scars, lessons, and a voice that refused to be muted. She didn't arrive in Washington with the polish of the establishment, she arrived with the authenticity of someone who had lived the struggles others only debated. And that authenticity resonated. People looked at her and saw not just a politician, but a reflection of themselves, their struggles, their persistence, their hunger for dignity. Crockett's composure in moments of attack was not some performance coached by consultants. It was the calm of someone who had been tested long before cameras were pointed in her direction. She knew what it felt like to be mocked, to be doubted, to be told she didn't belong. And she knew what it felt like to prove every one of those voices wrong. That resilience became her armor. Her sharp wit became her blade. Audiences connected with her because she was both fire and calm. She could meet arrogance with poise, meet dismissal with laughter, and then, when the moment demanded, unleash words so cutting they left opponents scrambling. She was relatable because she didn't pretend the struggle wasn't real. She admitted it. She embodied it. She turned it into power. So when Tim Scott sat across from her, confident that his insult would be the final word, he was playing a game he thought he had mastered. What he didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had been playing it her entire life, and she had learned to win not by being louder, but by being sharper. Not by being cruel, but by being undeniable. Every insult she had ever endured had prepared her for this. Every dismissal she had turned into motivation, every barrier she had broken through, every underestimation she had survived, it all converged in this moment. The chamber didn't just see a politician ready to respond. They saw a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. And that was his biggest mistake. The chamber had changed. What began as routine political theater now felt like the tightening of a drum, every beat echoing louder, every pause pulling the air out of the room. The audience, staffers, reporters, viewers glued to live streams, could sense it. Something was unraveling. Something was about to break. Tim Scott leaned into his moment, voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man convinced that dominance lay in volume and certainty. His words cut like jagged stone, laced with condescension, his posture radiating control. He launched into remarks designed not just to challenge but to belittle, each sentence dripping with the confidence of someone who had used this tactic countless times before. He struck at Crockett's credibility, mocked her tone, and tried to frame her as emotional rather than substantive. He thought he was winning. But winning is a strange illusion. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not rise to his bait. Instead, she sat steady, her expression unreadable, her hands folded with deliberate calm. Her silence in the face of his barrage was not weakness, it was strategy. With every measured breath, she shifted the balance of power without speaking a word. The more he pressed, the more the room began to tilt, not toward his dominance, but toward her composure. The unease was visible now. Reporters glanced at each other, unsure of how to capture the tension in real time. Staffers fidgeted in their chairs, sensing the rhythm of the exchange shifting in ways they could not predict. Even the cameras seemed to draw closer, their lenses tightening on the woman who hadn't yet spoken, as though instinctively preparing for something monumental. Scott pressed harder, raising his voice, his words spilling into the air with forced bravado. Each insult landed with less conviction than the last, because what he did not understand was that the silence he interpreted as weakness was, in truth, the storm gathering itself. Crockett's restraint created anticipation. Every second she held back stretched the room tighter, like a bowstring pulled further and further. Her eyes told the story before her lips ever moved. They were steady, unwavering, and impossibly clear. She was not rattled. She was waiting. Watching. Calculating. The effect was magnetic. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. The audience in the chamber shifted forward, sensing that something unforgettable, was about to happen. The villain thought he had secured control, but in truth, he had set the stage for his undoing. And then, in a single moment, restraint gave way to revelation. The silence was deafening. For a long, suspended moment, Jasmine Crockett simply sat there, the weight of Scott's words still hanging in the air like smoke after a firework. He believed he had scorched the room. He believed the silence was his victory. But Crockett's stillness was not surrender, it was the gathering of a storm. She leaned forward just slightly, her hands unclasping as she took a deliberate breath. Her gaze locked on Scott, steady and unblinking, and the chamber seemed to contract around them. Every eye in the room followed the subtle shift, every microphone bent to her voice before it even emerged. She didn't rush. She didn't flail. She let the tension ripen, stretching the audience's anticipation until it trembled. And then, she spoke. Her words landed not as an explosion, but as a razor's edge, sharp, precise, and devastating in their clarity. She didn't shout. She didn't match his volume. Instead, she delivered a clapback so clean that it sliced through Scott's performance like glass through silk. She exposed the hypocrisy embedded in his attack, turning his own words into evidence of his arrogance. Line by line, she dismantled his posture of superiority, showing the emptiness behind it. "You talk about dignity," she said, her tone even, unwavering, "but every word you've spoken tonight strips it away, not from me, but from yourself. You call me emotional, but what I see is a man afraid of truth, hiding behind volume because he cannot handle substance." The room froze. Reporters' pens hovered mid-sentence. Staffers' heads jerked up, eyes wide. The first gasp rippled through the chamber, sharp and involuntary, followed by a low murmur that spread like a wave. Scott's face shifted. The smirk that had carried him through countless debates faltered. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted, searching for footing he no longer had. The armor of arrogance he had worn so easily began to crack, each pause in Crockett's words widening the fracture. And Crockett pressed forward. "You dismiss people like me because it's easier than addressing what we're saying. But dismissiveness doesn't make you right. It just makes you afraid." The words were a scalpel, carving into his image. She did not rant, she revealed. She drew from the power of lived experience, channeling not only her own voice but the voices of all those who had been brushed aside, diminished, and underestimated. Her clapback was not just a response, it was an indictment. The silence deepened, broken only by gasps and the shuffle of restless feet. A staffer stifled a laugh. A reporter's jaw dropped open. The crowd was transfixed, caught in the electricity of a moment that felt historic, cinematic, irreversible. Scott shifted in his seat. His hands fidgeted against the desk. His lips tightened as though he wanted to interject, but every time he opened his mouth, Crockett's next line shut him down before he could recover. She had seized the rhythm, and he was left scrambling, visibly shrinking under the weight of composure he could not match. And then came the strike that sealed it. "You tried to silence me," she said, her voice soft yet resonant, "but understand this, silence has never saved us. Speaking truth, even when it shakes the room, that's what makes history." The chamber erupted, not in applause, but in a stunned, collective intake of breath. Every camera captured the instant the tide turned. Crockett's calm ferocity illuminated the room while Scott's facade collapsed under the spotlight. He wasn't speechless because he had nothing to say, he was speechless because he knew, for once, that nothing he said could undo the moment. The murmurs swelled. Tweets were already being drafted, phones buzzing with clipped video ready to explode across timelines. Reporters leaned into one another, whispering variations of the same phrase, "Did you just hear that?" Scott sat rigid, face taut, forced to endure the longest few seconds of his career as cameras immortalized his stunned expression. The imbalance of power was undeniable. He had entered the chamber expecting to dominate. Instead, he had been dismantled, and his undoing had been broadcast in real time. Crockett, however, did not revel in the silence she had created. She leaned back, her expression calm, almost serene, as if she knew she had said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. Her composure was its own punctuation mark, her silence after the clapback louder than his entire speech. The moment stretched, then settled, leaving a charged stillness in its wake. Viewers watching from living rooms and phones across the country felt the goosebumps ripple. This wasn't just political sparring, it was transformation. A single clapback had shifted the narrative, redefining who held power in that room. Scott blinked, still searching for footing that would never return. Because in that chamber, under the hot glare of cameras, the arrogance that had carried him so far finally collapsed. And in its place, Jasmine Crockett's truth rang out, undeniable, unforgettable, unstoppable. The chamber may have fallen into silence, but outside its walls, the noise was deafening. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's clapback, the internet lit up like a lightning storm. Clips of her response, trimmed down to 30-second bursts of fire, spread across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook with the speed of a digital wildfire. Hashtags erupted, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag speechless Scott, hashtag dignity wins. Each one climbed the trending charts, fueled by thousands of shares and comments from people who felt as though they had witnessed a cultural moment, not just a political exchange. The phrase, "standing ovation moment," trended alongside the video as users replayed her words on loop, their captions filled with fire emojis and declarations like, "This is what leadership looks like." Memes were instant. Scott's stunned expression was captured and remixed into GIFs, side-by-sides, and captions that mocked the collapse of his composure. Crockett, meanwhile, was crowned with digital laurels, superimposed in boxing rings, portrayed as superheroes, her calm glare immortalized in still shots that spread faster than any official campaign poster could dream of. In one viral edit, her line, "Silence has never saved us," flashed in bold letters over her image, paired with triumphant music, and viewed millions of times within hours. Supporters flooded her accounts with praise. Comments stacked by the thousands, legendary clapback. "This is why we fight." She didn't just speak for herself, she spoke for all of us. For progressives, immigrants, women, and anyone who had felt the sting of being dismissed, Crockett's response wasn't just satisfying, it was personal validation. It was proof that composure and truth could still triumph over arrogance and dismissal. The ripple effects reached beyond her base. Political commentators across the spectrum were forced to acknowledge what had unfolded. Liberal analysts hailed it as one of the most powerful live exchanges in recent memory. Even some conservative pundits admitted, grudgingly, that Scott had been caught off guard and left speechless. Editorials hit the presses before dawn, with headlines that framed the night as a turning point. "Crockett redefines the debate," one read. "The clapback heard across America," declared another. Celebrities joined in. Musicians, actors, athletes, people with massive platforms, retweeted her clip, adding their voices to the chorus. A famous singer wrote, "That was art. That was courage. That was history." A comedian quipped, "Tim Scott is going to need ice for that burn." And an activist amplified her words, urging followers to share them in classrooms and community meetings as inspiration. It wasn't just entertainment, it was empowerment. Teachers were showing their students the clip as an example of speaking truth to power. Community leaders cited it as a rallying moment. Across living rooms, kitchens, and barbershops, people replayed the exchange and nodded with satisfaction. Finally, someone had said what needed to be said. But what made the moment truly seismic was not only the laughter, the memes, or the trending hashtags. It was the way Crockett's words began to crystallize into something larger. They transcended the viral cycle and started to feel like a lesson, a call, a demand. Because behind the jokes and the applause, there was a deeper current flowing, a recognition that this wasn't just about one clapback. It was about a woman standing tall in the face of arrogance and, with composure, rewriting the script of who gets to speak with authority in America. The internet roared. The nation buzzed. Tim Scott's silence became a punchline. Jasmine Crockett's words became a rallying cry. But beyond the memes, something deeper was taking root. When the storm of applause, memes, and headlines began to settle, Jasmine Crockett did something that separated her from those who see viral moments as the endgame. She reframed the attack, not as a personal feud, not as a win in a political spat, but as a lesson America needed to hear. She reminded her audience, both in the chamber and across the country, that what mattered was not the insult hurled at her but the dignity with which she chose to respond. Dignity, she said, is greater than disrespect. Disrespect is cheap, thrown like stones in the dark. But dignity, that's built brick by brick, in patience, in resilience, in refusing to shrink when the world demands your silence. Her words became a mirror for millions. For anyone who had ever been underestimated, told they were too loud, too emotional, too unqualified, she offered a blueprint: stand tall, answer with truth, and never let arrogance have the final word. She didn't just defend herself, she elevated the moment into something bigger, something that stretched beyond party lines, beyond political theater. She spoke of empowerment, not the kind handed down from titles or offices, but the empowerment found in knowing your worth when others try to strip it away. Her wit was not just a weapon against Scott, it was proof that intelligence, clarity, and composure could pierce through any performance of power. Where he relied on volume, she relied on substance. Where he leaned on dismissal, she leaned on undeniable truth. And truth carried further. Crockett's moment became symbolic for broader struggles. Women who had fought to be heard in boardrooms and classrooms saw themselves in her calm defiance. Immigrants who had been told to go back saw themselves in her clarity. Black Americans, long dismissed or silenced in places of power, saw her as a continuation of a legacy of strength. Her clapback was more than a political rebuttal, it was a cultural declaration: we are here, we are worthy, and we will not be silenced. And as she stood in that chamber, the weight of history behind her and the eyes of a nation upon her, her words rose into a crescendo. This was not about winning a debate. It was about rewriting the narrative of who gets to hold the mic, who gets to speak without apology, who gets to define dignity in the face of scorn. Because in America, the last word belongs not to arrogance, but to truth. Tim Scott attacked. He expected dominance, silence, a chamber bowed to his arrogance. But Jasmine Crockett's epic clapback left him speechless. In that single exchange, the balance of power shifted, not just in the room, but in the hearts of millions who watched it unfold. Her response wasn't just a rebuttal. It was proof that truth, when spoken with composure and conviction, has the power to cut through arrogance like light through shadow. It was a reminder that resilience is not quiet submission but the courage to stand tall when others try to diminish you. Crockett's words rang out because they were more than political, they were human, rooted in dignity, and charged with the spirit of every person who has ever been underestimated. In that moment, America witnessed more than a debate. It witnessed a lesson, that arrogance crumbles when confronted with authenticity, that disrespect shrivels before dignity, and that the last word belongs not to those who shout the loudest but to those who speak the truth. And now, the story belongs to you. If Jasmine Crockett's stand inspired you, if her fire, her clarity, her strength spoke to your own journey, don't let this moment fade into another viral clip. Carry it forward. Share it, speak about it, let it remind you that your own voice, too, carries power. Subscribe to this channel for more stories where truth triumphs over arrogance, where dignity stands against dismissal, where we uncover the battles that shape the soul of this nation. Share this video so others can feel what you felt. Join the movement that says we will not be silenced. Because tonight proved it once again, arrogance may roar, but truth always claims the final word.